What disappeared from the average household didn't vanish all at once. It left slowly, over decades, in pieces so small that most people only recognized the absence years later, if at all. By the time anyone thought to ask where it had gone, the systems that had carried it were already restructured around its removal. This wasn't about a single product or a specific food. It was about something more fundamental: the gradual elimination of a certain kind of domestic knowledge, the quiet removal of skills that had, for generations, connected people to what they ate and how it was made. The change didn't announce itself. It embedded itself into the rhythm of ordinary life, into the layout of kitchens, the design of appliances, the structure of the work week, and the expectations placed on those who fed their families. At the time, this was considered progress. The mid-20th century brought with it a wave of industrial solutions designed to simplify the labor of feeding a household. Convenience was the language used to describe these changes: time-saving, modern, efficient. The tools and techniques that had once defined domestic food preparation, canning, preserving, fermenting, baking from scratch, rendering fats, making stocks, began to be reframed not as valuable skills, but as burdens, relics of a harder, less enlightened time. This reframing didn't happen by accident. It was embedded in advertising, in home economics curricula, in the design of suburban kitchens, and in the cultural messaging around what it meant to be a competent, modern homemaker. The narrative was clear. To continue doing things the old way was to resist progress. To adopt the new products, the new methods, the new packaged solutions was to participate in the future. Most people didn't question it. The changes came packaged as improvements, backed by the authority of science, nutrition experts, and major corporations. The language was one of liberation, freedom from drudgery, from inefficiency, from the endless cycle of labor that had once defined the domestic sphere. And in many ways, that language was persuasive because it contained truth. The work of feeding a family without modern conveniences was demanding, often exhausting, particularly for women who carried the bulk of that responsibility. But what was lost in that transition wasn't just labor. It was also knowledge. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be written down in a single recipe or reduced to a set of instructions. It was intuitive, learned through repetition and observation, passed from one generation to the next, not through formal teaching, but through presence, through watching, through doing. It was the knowledge of how food behaved, how ingredients transformed, how to judge doneness by sight and smell and texture, how to improvise when something went wrong, how to make use of what was available rather than what was prescribed. This knowledge didn't disappear overnight. It faded gradually, as fewer people practiced it, as fewer kitchens were set up to support it, as fewer hours in the day were available for it. It faded as the infrastructure that had once supported it, local dairies, neighborhood butchers, seasonal markets, backyard gardens, was replaced by centralized systems designed for scale and standardization. It faded as the social structures that had once transmitted it, extended families living in proximity, multi-generational households, communities organized around shared labor, were disrupted by suburbanization, geographic mobility, and the demands of industrial employment. Most people never noticed this at the time. The loss was too gradual, too diffuse. It didn't register as loss because it was simultaneous with gain. Gain in convenience, in variety, in the sheer abundance of available options. The supermarket became a symbol of prosperity, its shelves stocked with an ever-expanding array of options. The freezer, the microwave, the pre-packaged meal, all of these were celebrated as victories over scarcity and struggle. But what was being lost wasn't visible on those shelves. It was invisible, encoded in the hands and minds of people who had once known how to do things that were no longer necessary. And because it was invisible, it was easy to dismiss, easy to say that it didn't matter, that the new ways were simply better, that nostalgia for the old ways was sentimental and misguided. The real impact appeared years later, not immediately, not in a single generation, but slowly, as the distance between people and the origins of their food widened, as the skills required to produce food from raw ingredients became specialized knowledge rather than common practice, as the ability to judge quality, to recognize freshness, to understand what had been done to food before it reached the table became something most people simply didn't have. By the time the consequences were visible, the habits were already set. Entire generations had grown up in kitchens where certain activities simply didn't happen anymore, where bread came from a bag, where stock came from a cube, where vegetables came pre-cut and pre-washed, where meals came pre-assembled and required only reheating. The infrastructure that had once supported a different kind of food system had been dismantled or consolidated. The knowledge that had once been common had become rare, preserved only in pockets, by hobbyists, by immigrants who had brought it with them, by those who had consciously chosen to resist the dominant trends. And this loss had consequences that extended beyond the kitchen. It affected the way people understood their relationship to food, to their bodies, to the land, to the labor of others. It affected the way they made decisions about what to eat, what to buy, what to trust. It affected their ability to discern quality from marketing, substance from appearance. It affected their capacity to feed themselves and their families in ways that felt connected, intentional, rooted in something more than convenience and cost. These consequences were difficult to name. They didn't manifest as a single identifiable problem. They were diffuse, complex, entangled with other changes, economic, social, technological. They were easy to attribute to individual choices rather than systemic shifts, easy to frame as personal failure rather than structural loss. This wasn't the fault of individuals. It wasn't the fault of the people who adopted the new products, who reorganized their kitchens, who stopped making things from scratch. They were responding rationally to the circumstances they faced, to the demands of work, to the absence of support, to the pressures of time and money, to the sheer weight of everything else they were expected to manage. The system that produced this loss was designed for efficiency and profit, not for the preservation of knowledge or the maintenance of connection. It was designed to centralize production, to standardize outputs, to reduce labor costs, to create dependencies on manufactured products. It was designed to turn what had once been a set of common skills into a market opportunity, a space where products could be sold to replace what people had once done for themselves. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply how industrial capitalism functioned. It identified inefficiencies, places where labor could be reduced, where processes could be automated, where profit could be extracted, and it reorganized systems around those opportunities. The fact that this reorganization resulted in the loss of knowledge, the erosion of skills, the weakening of community ties, the distancing of people from the sources of their sustenance, these were externalities, side effects. Not the goal, but not considered important enough to prevent. The people who made the decisions that shaped this system weren't thinking about what would be lost. They were thinking about what could be gained: market share, efficiency, growth. They were thinking in terms that made sense within the logic of their institutions, corporations, government agencies, agricultural boards, food manufacturers. They were responding to incentives that rewarded scale and standardization, not diversity and resilience. They were operating within frameworks that measured success in terms of output and profit, not in terms of knowledge preserved or connections maintained. And the people who lived through this transition, who experienced it as consumers and homemakers and parents, were not equipped to resist it. They didn't have the language to name what was being lost. They didn't have the power to halt the consolidation of the food system or the restructuring of domestic labor. They didn't have access to the information that would have allowed them to see the long-term consequences of the choices they were making, or, more accurately, the choices that were being made for them. Because this was, ultimately, not a series of individual choices, but a structural transformation. A reorganization of the systems that determined what food was available, how it was produced, how it was sold, how it was prepared. A transformation that was driven by forces far larger than any individual household, any single decision, any particular product. The loss that resulted from this transformation wasn't visible in the moment. It was only visible in retrospect, when people began to notice that they didn't know how to do things their grandparents had known, that they couldn't recognize the signs of quality their parents had once taken for granted, that they felt disconnected from their food in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. And even then, the loss was often misunderstood, framed as a personal failing, a lack of willpower, a failure to prioritize health, an inability to resist convenience. The structural nature of the loss was obscured by the cultural emphasis on individual responsibility, on personal choice, on the idea that anyone could simply decide to do things differently if they cared enough. But you can't choose to practice skills you were never taught. You can't choose to access infrastructure that no longer exists. You can't preserve knowledge that was never transmitted to you. The loss wasn't a failure of individual will. It was a failure of systems, educational systems, economic systems, cultural systems, to recognize the value of what was disappearing and to make space for its preservation. By the time anyone thought to ask what had been lost, the mechanisms that could have prevented that loss were already gone. The small-scale farms that had supplied local communities, the neighborhood shops that had connected producers and consumers, the extended family networks that had transmitted knowledge across generations, the time and space in daily life that had allowed for the practice of complex, labor-intensive skills. What replaced these mechanisms was designed for a different purpose. It was designed to feed more people, more quickly, more cheaply. It was designed to reduce the labor required of individuals and to centralize that labor in industrial facilities. It was designed to create products that could be stored longer, transported further, sold more widely. And, in many ways, it succeeded at those goals. But success at one set of goals doesn't mean success at all goals. The system that replaced what came before was optimized for scale and efficiency, not for knowledge transmission or skill preservation. It was optimized for profit and growth, not for connection or resilience. It was optimized for the short term, for the immediate, for the measurable, not for the long-term consequences that would only become visible decades later. And those consequences are still unfolding, still revealing themselves in patterns of disconnection, in the erosion of food literacy, in the loss of culinary traditions, in the inability of people to feed themselves outside the framework of industrial food production, still revealing themselves in the way people relate to their bodies, to their health, to the land, to each other. The system that made this loss invisible didn't do so intentionally. It simply didn't account for what couldn't be measured, what couldn't be sold, what couldn't be reduced to a transaction. It didn't account for the value of knowledge that lived in practice rather than in manuals. It didn't account for the importance of skills that couldn't be outsourced or automated. It didn't account for the human need to feel connected to the sources of sustenance, to understand the processes that transformed raw ingredients into nourishment, to have some degree of autonomy and agency in one of the most fundamental aspects of existence. And because the system didn't account for these things, they were lost. Not deliberately destroyed, but simply not protected. Not actively eliminated, but not actively preserved. allowed to fade because they weren't considered essential, because they didn't generate profit, because they didn't fit into the logic of industrial efficiency. The invisibility of this loss is part of what makes it so difficult to address. You can't demand the return of something you don't realize is missing. You can't advocate for the preservation of knowledge you never knew existed. You can't organize to protect systems that have already been dismantled. What remains is a vague sense that something is wrong, a feeling that food doesn't taste the way it used to, that meals don't provide the same satisfaction, that the act of feeding oneself and one's family has become more complicated and less rewarding than it should be. A suspicion that the convenience that was promised came at a cost that wasn't fully disclosed. And this wasn't the only change. Similar patterns followed in other domains, other areas of life where knowledge and skill were replaced by products and services, where autonomy was traded for convenience, where complexity was reduced to simplicity at the cost of understanding and connection. And that pattern didn't stop there.